Hi, this is Claudia Filos with the Center for Atlantic Studies, and I'm so delighted to be here today. We have a special guest, Professor Richard Martin. Thank you for joining us, Professor Martin.
Thank you.
And today you're going to be talking to us about the Táin, and in particular, we're going to be thinking about the boyhood deeds of Cuchulain. So we're really excited to talk about this topic. But first, I also want to welcome all our participants who are joining us today in our Hangout. Thank you, everyone. And when you ask a question a little bit later, I hope that you will introduce yourself by name and tell us where you're from. And I also want to remind people that we do have a Q&A feature live that people can post questions if you're watching this through Google event. But right now, I'd like to turn and just share a little bit about your background, Richard. So right now, you are the professor at Stanford. You've been there since 2000. Before that, you taught classics for 18 years at Princeton University. You're currently working on several books, including a book on Homeric religion. You're also thinking about myth and ancient poetry and performance. You're interested in interpreting Greek poetry in the light of performance traditions and social practices, and your primary interests are in Homeric epic, Greek comedy, mythology, and ancient religion. Your research is really informed by comparative evidence ranging from fieldwork on oral traditions in contemporary Crete to studies in medieval Irish literature. So that's one reason why we're especially excited to have you join us today. I know that you, among your major publications, are a book called Healing, Sacrifice, and Battle, Amekana and Related Concepts in Early Greek Poetry, also The Language of Heroes, Speech, and Performance in the Iliad, which is available in its entirety on the CHS website, so people can check that out if they go to the publications page. And you've also published books for general audiences, including Myths of the Ancient Greeks. You have content in Bulfinch's mythology and a number of articles on Greek, Latin, and Irish literature. I'm so delighted that you're joining us. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, community, and Claudia. And this is an interesting invitation because I don't often get asked to talk about my Celtic side, right, which goes back to my undergraduate days and earlier. So the first thing I'll try to do is say why I think it's relevant. I'm interested in Iliad and Odyssey, the theme of the warrior, and especially how the warrior first comes to war, the kind of initiation of the warrior, which I think is an important theme both in the Odyssey, where it's a little bit more obvious, and in the Iliad. So why Irish? Well, there's a personal interest. You know, when I was growing up in Dorchester in a three-decker, my grandparents lived with us, and they actually have been raised in bilingual households back in County Clare, as I discovered now from the census of 1901, although they didn't use it a lot, but there was Irish thrown around. And then I took it when I went to college, and I realized that, you know, Irish is part of a big happy family of Indo-European languages, so I got into that while doing Greek and Latin. I want to say just a minute, a couple of things about the comparative method and what I will and will not be trying to argue. So as you know, the really strict use of the comparative method in linguistics is to reconstruct history. It's to try to figure out what, say, the original form of a word or even an institution was in perhaps 3000 BC, when the Indo-European speakers, who eventually became speakers of Sanskrit, of Latin, of Greek, and most of the European languages, you know, what their language is like. Now, that's a kind of fantasy. We know we can't really reconstruct it, but it's a useful tool because it lets you see how semantics have changed over the years. So if we know, for example, that Sanskrit and Greek and maybe Iranian had a certain word and a certain meaning, and then we see the same word in Irish or another Indo-European language, and we see it has a different meaning, we can begin to try to explain change. So that's a historical reconstruction. That's not what I'm trying to do with this material. People have tried to do it, and I'm happy to give names. The major figure is Georges Dumézil, D-U-M-E-Z-I-L, who is a French comparatist in the 20th century and wrote lots of books about basically Indo-European epic, claiming that a lot of the things that we see in the Iliad, the Odyssey, in Roman historical tales and in Celtic were derived from a kind of inherited Indo-European epic tradition. My interest is a little bit more general, so you could call it the broad comparative method rather than the narrow. And what I try to do in this particular thought experiment is focus on that theme of initiation, which happens to be very clear in the Old Irish material, specifically in what we call the Cattle-Raid of Cooley, or the Táin Bó Cúailnge. This title, Táin Bó, is actually a kind of generic title because there were also other cattle raids, the Táin Bó Flidlis, the Táin Bó Froich, the Táin Bó Regavan. That theme of cattle raiding, of course, comes up in the Iliad and the Odyssey as well, in just a kind of cameo appearance. But it's probably a theme you could argue has an Indo-European antiquity. In the use of this particular theme in the Big Táin, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, what I wanted to really get your opinions on were these stories of the major hero, Cuchulain. Let me back up a little bit, and just to make sure we're all on the same page, and you might not have reread the Táin Bó Cúailnge recently, a tiny plot summary. So it begins with this amazing pillow talk where the king and queen of Connaught, Ailill and his wife Mev, are talking and comparing how much each one has. And they have all the same stuff except the king, Ailill, has a bull, a white bull, and she doesn't have a bull. In fact, the bull that she wants belongs to the enemy territory, the people of Ulster. Connaught is what is now kind of northwest Ireland. Ulster is, as you know, northeast Ireland, and these are eternal enemies in Irish epic tradition. So they decide to mount an invasion of Ulster in order to get the marvelous brown bull, who's the bull of Cooley, the Don Cúailnge, and therefore they have to encounter the main defender of Ulster, who is the hero whose name means the Hound of Cuchulain, Cuchulain. Cu is cognate with the Greek kuon, the word that eventually gives us cynic in English. So Hound, Cuchulain is the genitive of Cullen, and there's a story, as you know, behind how he got that name too. There are weirder backstories that I won't get into, and you know, as with most mythic traditions, every story that you touch brings up another 3 or 4 stories. But it turns out that the bulls themselves are ultimate druidic transformations of 2 pig herders. Yet another Indo-European motif. The pig herder with magic powers, and you could think of the Odyssey there if you want. I won't forecast for you the bloody ending of the Táin, but it doesn't end well for the bulls, put it that way. It doesn't even end well for the Connaught people. And it ends okay for the Ulster people because of Cuchulain. Now, these tales that we see in the Táin Bó Cúailnge probably date from Indo-European antiquity, but the form in which we have them is in 2 early and mid 12th century manuscripts, 12th century AD. And so the language can be detected to be Old Irish, but they're in a kind of Middle Irish disguise. Old Irish goes from like 600 to 900 AD, and then certain changes happen that make it more like Modern Irish. We don't really know to what extent they've been affected by 2 things, Christianity and the classical tradition itself. So that complicates the comparative experiment a little bit. It's well known that some of the Old Irish pagan material, like the Cattle-Raid of Cooley, comes in manuscripts that also contain Christian stories side by side. So it could be complicated in that way. I don't think that what we see in the Cattle-Raid, however, is a copy of the Iliad or the Odyssey. or of Latin material. But we have to keep open the possibility that there's more than simply an inherited Indo-European connection to any given motif. Okay, so far, I'd love to talk about other things that are in the classical tradition and in Irish. There's been some work done increasingly on the kind of blend-ins of classical and pagan, and I'll just tease you by saying there is a Irish version of the Odyssey, which takes about 12 pages to recount, and it's crazy, and take you half an hour to read, but that's a story for another day. So let's focus instead on these boyhood deeds. That too is a genre. It's got the genre name Mac Nivrada, which basically means the doings of the child. Mac is, son, as in Macul. Professor Greg Naj's brother, Joseph Naj, who teaches at UCLA, is actually one of the world experts, excuse me, on this genre when it comes to slightly later characters, the so-called Fenians, the followers of Finn McCool. And he's got a whole book you might want to read called The Wisdom of the Outlaw. But as I say, he's dealing with the Fenian stories, and I would like to talk about Cuchulain and his boyhood deeds. As you go through these boyhood deeds, I think you see, by my count, 6 major motifs that can also help us think through the Iliad and the Odyssey. But before I get to that, I wanted to open the floor and ask you about your favorite boyhood deeds, those of you who've read the so-called 4 stories, F-O-R-E, the Reimskela of the Táin. You remember that these are told by an Ulsterman who is in exile with the Connaught people, and he's being hooked into this cow expedition, to this cattle raid, by Mev and Ailill, and his name is Fergus MacRoich. And so Fergus tells them, as they're about to encounter Cuchulain, it's a great suspense technique. Here's what you need to know about this guy. He's this amazing guy who, when he was 5 years old, killed the following people, and when he was 7, killed the following people, and now he's 17, but he's really a monster. He's really a berserk guy. And so it's entertainment within the entertainment. It's a kind of flashback to the boyhood of the guy who's still only 17, Cuchulain. I don't know if you read these before or you're new to them for the first time, but how did they strike you, the boyhood deeds of Cuchulain?
Great. It looks like Jackie has a response.
Hi, Richard. I'm going to sidetrack a little bit because I've not read any of the Irish literature, but I was hoping, and feel free to pass on this if it's not what you wanted to talk about, just about cattle rustling in general, the concept of it, because when I first read the Odyssey and Odysseus is back with Penelope and regain his throne and his wife, and one of the first things he says to replenish, my stockyards, I'm going to go out and steal some sheep and goats. And I thought, oh, what a rascal, he just comes back, everything's right, and he goes off raiding again. And then about a year later, my concept of cattle rustling did a 180 turn, because I think I was viewing it from a more modern point of view when I was reading about the mountain tribes or cultures of Sardinia, a really primitive culture that's, has survived up until relatively modern times. And cattle rustling is a sign of bravery, of honor, of recklessness, but it also seems to form alliances, because you're not going to raid your next door neighbor, you're going to raid the one after that. So it seems to have a political alliance benefit to the culture. So I was like, oh my God, I've got this all wrong. And then now I hear you talk about cattle rustling, so I'm sorry this is long, but I don't know what to make of cattle rustling. Is that an initiation, right? Or
I think you have it exactly. You nailed it. It's the initiation rite. Uh, so let me just give you two kind of responses to that. One is the mythopoeic, and one is the anthropological. Uh, Mythopoeically, in terms of Greek and Irish and Indic, also cattle rustling is the way to get women. Uh, in Greek tradition, outside of the Iliad and the Odyssey, there are stories of Melampus and these other mythic young men who are recruited to get cows, and in a non-monetary economy, this is the way that you kind of make yourself a big man, and you get lots of bride gifts to win the best bride. So you just go out and get a lot of cattle. And it's interesting you mentioned the Odyssey, because it's like Odysseus needs to become a husband again, become a groom again. So mythopoeically, it has to do with courtship a lot, in Greek especially. Anthropologically, you have the $64,000 word, initiation. That's how you prove yourself. There is an incredible book which influenced me a long time ago by Michael Herzfeld, 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 called The Poetics of Manhood. And it's about not cattle, but sheep rustling in modern-day Crete. And he's talking about Crete of the 1980s. It's what forms alliances, because these guys, when they steal the sheep of their neighbors, leave behind tracks so that they can get caught. Because that's the kind of way, it's like tagging in graffiti. You were there. Look at how great I am. I was able to get these sheep out from under your nose. When you get caught, and it sounds like the Sardinian experience, you often become the best friend of the guy from whom you stole the sheep. And you become the kumbaros at his wedding, like the best man. So it's part of the integration of the culture that there's this exchange of sheep and cattle, but people are always trying to steal each other's to kind of show off, and that's an initiatory thing. So thank you for that. That's sorry, I was going to get to the word initiation eventually, but you took it right out of my mouth.
I think Tim may have a response to the question about the different deeds of Cuchulain.
Right. Hi, I'm Tim. I'm from Singapore. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the names. I'm going to get them terribly wrong, so I'll just call him the boy. I just like the story of how the boy got his name, where he's invited to dinner and his foster father or whoever forgets he's coming, and it's just this sort of wicked sense of humor that seems to be through the whole story. And I'm wondering whether the story was written to be humorous, or am I reading in more humor than there should be? The other question I've got. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, humor, it's all there, believe me, and the style of these things is kind of hard-bitten, almost Raymond Chandler, Hemingway-esque, short, punchy sentences, and then there'll be some poems scattered in there too. So yes. To be funny. And your other question or questions?
Right. I noticed that with the boys that he's playing these games against, there are always 150. Is there a special meaning to that number, or does it just mean lots?
I think it's lots. It's more impressive than 12. And if you start doing the Iliad and Odyssey number game, there are, as you know, things are coming in like 3s, 12s, sometimes multiples of 12s. And people have tried to find significance, but I don't think it's really possible. So it's just like a lot.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay. So other reactions to the 4 stories, I too agree that the naming, because his original name was Shetanta, and he only becomes the Hound as a kind of substitute because he killed the Hound of Cuchulain, the smith. So he becomes Cuchulain that way. It's just amazing. He's 7, right, when he does that. The other ones you might have thought were kind of bloody, but yeah, I'd love to hear.
Richard, when I read the story, I thought of the Heracles stories about how he became strong by carrying a calf, and he just kept getting stronger and stronger as the calf grew into being a bull.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of Heracles overlaps. It's interesting there, especially because we do know that there was a medieval Irish kind of translation of Heracles material, the story of Hercules, and so it's not impossible that the scribes have also heard classical renditions, or be that just both cultures are inheriting these heroic notions. But and notice again, it has to do with cows and bulls, right? That even strength building, it's a great innovation that our gyms should get, right? Instead of, well, I think the PETA would probably have a problem with that, lifting animals, but the animal gets older as you get older, so it gets heavier, and so you instant upgrade.
Awesome. You know, one of the things I was struck by the use of chariots. So the sort of an evolving relationship between himself and I guess a charioteer sidekick, or so those are kind of, I see parallels to what happens in the Iliad between sort of a primary hero and their charioteering sidekick, their driver. Are those kind of things that we want to think about? Those kind of connections?
Precisely, yeah, and there I think you can talk about a trifecta, because in Irish, in Greek, and in Sanskrit, in Indic, this relationship is huge. You know, think of the Bhagavad Gita in the Mahabharata, where it's all a conversation between charioteer and guy in the chariot. And if you think about it, again, anthropologically, this is kind of a older driver figure. It's like taking a driving test with your trusted elder brother or something. So there are lots of forms of affiliation beyond just the family. There's the foster family, as you already mentioned, and the chariot is probably, you know, a reminiscence of Indo-European technology. We know in Homeric times, as depicted, they're always using chariots, but they don't quite know how to use them in warfare. They use them as kind of taxis. They get up to the lines, and they get out of the chariot, then they get back in. It seems like a heritage item in at least that culture. And certainly in Ireland in the 12th century AD, they weren't using chariots, but they might have had them in, you know, the 1st century BC. So it's an Iron Age relic in Irish. It's a Bronze Age thing in the Greek and the Indic. Well, you know, as we think of these stories, I wanted to pick out 6 motifs, if that's okay, and bounce these off you and see if they
Yes, please. That's beautiful.
resonate or strike a chord with things that you've been reading in Iliad and Odyssey. So here are my 6 motifs in the warrior's rite of passage, the rite de passage that Cuchulain does. Number 1 is he chooses fame instead of a long life. That's like too easy, right? Number 2, there's the importance, as you already brought up, of renaming. And now I'm thinking, hint, hint, Odyssey more than Iliad. Number 3, there's the obtaining of adult weapons at the very apogee of your initiation. That's, you know, the moment of manhood is the moment you get weapons. For this one, I'm always reminded of that Willie Nelson song, which I will not sing for you, but it begins this way. It's called The Devil's Right Hand. About the time that Daddy left to fight the big war, I saw my first pistol in the general store. In the general store when I was 13, thought it was the finest thing I ever had seen. And he goes on to tell about how he gets his first gun and he kills his first guy and so forth. And he or it's the devil's right hand, the pistol, because it's going to get you into trouble. But the idea that initiation, manhood, weapons, that goes way back. It's not just Texas or other places. So, number 4, the theme of anger often related to domestic violence. Cuchulain is one angry dude, right? And here, I hope you remember the incredible scene where he's so heated up as a warrior that they have to plunge him into vats of water, and the vats keep boiling over and busting out. And then the women have to come out and bare their breasts and say, these are the warriors that you're going to fight with today. So anger, sex, violence, you know, if anybody films this, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, I think it's got to be Quentin Tarantino.
Okay.
Number 5, related to this, I would say, is women in a kind of oppositional role. For instance, Cuchulain disobeys his mother. She says, you know, don't go out to that court. And he takes off with his little hurley stick, throwing his ball and running up and catching it, and runs into trouble. And then women at the very end there, as I said. And in the Táin Bó Cúailnge as a whole, Queen Maeve is like the ultimate oppositional woman. She is really scary. She learns about a group of 3,000 elite warriors who might, number 1, get all the credit instead of the Ulstermen, or number 2, if they leave them behind, they're going to take over. I'm sorry, the Connaught men. If they leave them behind, they'll take over Connaught. So her solution is just kill them all. And the men in her entourage say, whoa, 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 wait a minute, we can't just do that. And they come up with a better solution. But oppositional women, women who are trying to somehow block the hero, is a big theme. And number 6, I think I see in these tales the kind of disconnected status of the young hero. He's sort of afloat, you know, he's not integrated yet into his Ulster setting. And in the case of Cuchulain, through a weird fluke in his DNA, he's not totally an Ulster person, and that's why he is the main defender, because once every year, the Ulster men have pains like women in childbirth, and they can't function at all. They're just totally debilitated. They have those pains, the curse of the Ulstermen, for yet other mythic reasons that we don't need to go into, basically having to do with having made a pregnant woman race against a horse. But that's a whole nother story.
Okay.
So Cuchulain doesn't fit in a way.
So he's disconnected. You know, I love that word, connected.
Yeah, with this set of 6 prime motifs, I'm thinking you can go to town on Iliad and Odyssey, and I'm sure things will percolate. So you tell me, what do you see happening here cross-culturally or cross-epically?
Great. You know, did you want to go through these little by little, or just see what's jumping out?
No, I think let's just reassociate, because that's like the first step in comparison. You see 2 things, they look kind of similar, you start asking, why is that? Or what's the pattern here?
Okay, well, I'm certainly going to invite our participants to join. I mean, I would just start off by saying, thinking about the first one, the idea of choosing fame and not a long life. I mean, that's a very obvious connection to the choice that Achilles is asked to make. But also, I thought it was really neat the fact that he overheard people talking about that, right? So the way that it happens is, I guess sort of the druid teacher is sort of talking to his boys, his students, and he tells them that here's what's going to happen. The person who gets their weapons today, right? Is that it? Is going to have everlasting fame but a short life. And so Cuchulain overhears this from way far away. He's off playing with his toys and then decides he's going to go for it. So just that idea of kleos as what's overheard, and that sort of, people weren't even talking to him, he just heard that.
Yeah, I love that. You know, etymologically, that's what kleos means. It's the thing that you hear. It's cognate with the word in English loud, L-O-U-D. But notice his Odyssean twist to that. He overhears it, and then he pretends when he goes to Conchobar that Kavad, the druid, has told him to go to Conchobar, which is not true. And Conchobar rats him out finally, but you always give in to Cuchulain. He's like Odysseus. You can't resist his charm.
That kind of cunning aspect. Okay, so
Yeah.
what other things? I'm wondering what other people are seeing.
Well, this is just something that only came. Sorry, this is Sarah from Scotland. Something that just came up when you were talking about these warriors who were ineffective because they had pains like women in childbirth. And I was just remembering a line in Iliad where Agamemnon is complaining that of a similar sort of pain. I have no idea if it's relevant or not, but that looked out at me.
Now
Whereas,
I
of course,
remember.
Achilles is a very competent warrior, and Agamemnon, of course, is, as a luster, but not very effective.
That's beautiful. I hadn't made that connection at all, but it's precisely that. That's the. There are several similes too. That's like the ultimate pain. And debilitating pain they recognize is not a male thing, but it's what women do. It's like the one thing that the Greek hero can never, well, one of them did manage to do it, Tiresias, who was both a man and a woman at different times, but it's like they know that's the ultimate pain. But I never thought of it in relation to Achilles, Agamemnon like that, so I'd love to hear more. Maybe that's a lead-in for yet another connection. And you mentioned Heracles. Remember the story that Agamemnon tells in Book 19 of the Iliad, when he's saying, "Oh, I screwed up," but he can't say that. He can't bring himself to say that. So instead, he tells a story of how Heracles turned out to be subordinated to his cousin Eurystheus. And the story goes, you'll remember, that Hera discovered that on a particular day, the hero who would be born that day would have complete sovereignty. And so she knew that Heracles was going to be born that day. She rushes down and she prevents his mother from giving birth. Talk about pains of childbirth. It kind of ties her up, binds her up, and accelerates the birth process of Heracles' little cousin, Eurystheus, who then gets sovereignty. So the notion of the hero, childbirth, pain, and this kind of gaming the system is the same motif as you get in Cuchulain, but in Cuchulain it's kind of split in different places. He's the guy who doesn't feel the childbirth pain, and he's the guy who gets the fame because he learned about the magic day from the druid.
That raises the idea of timing, right? So one of the things that Professor Naj has prompted us to think about in terms of ancient Greek heroes is about their timeliness or their lack of timeliness, right? Seasonality or not being seasonal. So the issues that you're raising there are bringing those to mind. Also, this idea of Hera impeding the birth of Heracles, this idea of a woman. I'm not sure if a goddess also would apply in that situation, but it raises a point. I think Helen may be thinking also about women and Maeve. Did you want to ask a question?
Yes, I'm Helen from Montreal, and I was wondering if you could talk about a little bit about Maeve, because she seems like a powerful woman, and she's got a big part. She plays a big part in the epic. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about her role, and because as I see in the 6th section, she goes to her chariot and she gets ready the chariot. So she's very active in the fight. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about her.
Yeah, I would love to, and I'd love to, see more work on the figure of Maeve. Let me start with her name. Although, etymology is not fate, but it can sometimes be a clarifying thing. So it's agreed that her name, Maeve, is related to the Indo-European words for mead, M-E-A-D, the honeyed wine, and the Greek word methu, that gives us drunkenness. Methusmenos, for example, means drunken. So she seems to be the intoxicated one or the intoxicating one. It's like she's the essence of intoxication in terms of her beauty, but in terms of her power too, to make men, especially, kind of lose it. You can think of her as like the female Dionysus, I suppose. I'm thinking of the Bacchae of Euripides and the power of Dionysus. Only when she does this, well, in a similar way, I suppose, her action also really affects communities. So she binds together the community of the Connaught men in the way that feasting and drinking, we know, even archaeologically, was hugely important to the Celts. She's sort of like the essence of what binds together the Celtic community, which is control of intoxicating beverages. I'm not going to make any comments about modern Celts at all in this connection, but certainly as they're depicted in Irish literature, one of the main social exchange mechanisms is getting all of your relations and friends together in a feasting house and giving them all the mead that they want, or beer, and food. And then other bad things often happen. So Mev, you know, in this very kind of elemental way, is like the element of intoxication. I don't know if that makes sense of other parts of her character. There are other more scatological stories that tell how she has like a bigger bladder than other women, and there's a women's urination contest in some tales where Mev wins. So she's just huge.
That is awesome. That is awesome. Helen, do you have a response?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes.
Could I think, Anne, did you raise your hand?
Well, this also reminds me of Beowulf, where the only thing the women did was dispense wine. We read Beowulf 2 or 3 months ago, didn't we? And I actually made a list of all the things women were doing, and all they were doing was dispensing wine. They were queens, but they didn't do anything else.
But you know, we would think first of all, oh, that's a kind of subsidiary role. But if you're in charge of the wine,
yes,
in effect, you do. That's a real power in the house.
Yes.
It makes me think about Penelope and her storeroom and
yes,
her kind of network of serving women. And the control, if you like, that, well, the relation between the serving women in the Odyssey and the suitors, yeah, the suitors can go and get cattle and wine, and they kind of manhandle the serving women, but the women are in charge of these stores. Mm-hmm. So it puts a different light on the kind of social relationships. I think you're exactly right. I hadn't thought of the Beowulf connection at all.
Yeah. Can I talk about the... Oh, sorry, Helen.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to change the subject, really. So if you had anything more on Maeve. No, okay.
Well,
is that okay, Claudia?
Can I change, just add in one thing from the Q&A, which is that Janet Oslak is pointing us towards a connection maybe between Maeve and Medea, and she's thinking about the word pharmacon. So just since that it has to do with what we were talking about, I just wanted to share that. So thank you, Janet, for that comment and connection. So please go ahead, Anne.
Yeah, I'm Anne from England. What really struck me when I read the passages was how touching the details were about Cuchulain behaving as a child. Because I was kind of expecting him to be sort of prematurely heroic. It's the choice of the people who did the writing, I suppose, but they kept referring to his little toys, yes, his little arrows, and the games that he plays in order to get himself across big distances.
Yes.
I thought that was really touching, to emphasize the part of him that isn't heroic.
Exactly, which is, you know, he's still a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old.
Yes.
And so it's perfect. It's like, you know, all of those little kids we've known, what would they rather do? You know, play with the ball, or you see these, instead of going out and killing people, he doesn't really like to do that. That's kind of a game with him. and what he really likes is chasing after deer and hooking them to his chariot and coming home with these wild deer. You know, it's. I think you're completely right. We have to see the real prepubescent nature of the hero. So I guess I would turn the question around and say, are the most successful heroes also the ones who somehow are still not socialized, not mature? It's like that part of their brain hasn't grown yet, and therefore they can do things that maybe a more mature, thinking, rational person would not do. It's like homicidal kids.
Yeah. So is that the disconnect that you have in mind? Is that a level of that disconnect? Disconnected
Yes,
from their own mentality?
And I'm thinking, because you brought up the special word disconnect, of the work of Sue Edmonds on the word nepios, Nepios, in Homer, you know, which always gets translated very badly as like, oh, you fool or something. Nepios, as Sue Edmonds showed, means disconnected. It doesn't mean infantile, not speaking, but not connected. And heroes are always trading it against one another as an insult, like, you nepios, you disconnected person. It's true that the hero is, almost by definition, disconnected. He's not going to be like everybody else. But at the same time, they're always aiming for some kind of integration that they don't quite get until, I know Greg Nage would say, until after death. And then they are integrated into the community as a cult figure.
Yeah. You know, I just want to share with everyone that Susan Edmonds' thesis will actually be available in its entirety on the CHS Publications website very, very soon, so people
Perfect commercial message there. Great.
Exactly. We're going to plug that because it's absolutely beautiful. Everyone should read that text. I also want to point out in our chat bar and in our Q&A that some of our community members are also pointing towards the connection between Helen serving drinks to Telemachus and Menelaus. We were just talking about women serving drinks. And we also have a comment about the unseasonality of the heroes. Janice pointed out, even though he is doing extraordinary deeds when he is very young, still his enemies are seeing him as too young to fight, so his initiation is also tied to acceptance by the society. I don't know if you have any response.
You know, I think you could take that one also and say his being out of season is a kind of tactical advantage. Here I think of baby Hermes in the Hymn to Hermes, and I know you folks have read everything, so I can just allude. The Hymn to Hermes is about a cattle raid where Hermes, the god, is a baby, and his first day on Earth he goes and he steals his older brother's cattle, and that's how he gets acknowledged on Olympus, that he's the player. But he's also unbelievable because he's just a little baby, and nobody believes that they could do anything to him. So being out of sync is like the ultimate weapon.
That's beautiful. You know, we do have another comment. It's a question, actually, by Dan McCain. I hope I'm saying that correctly. And this is a little bit of changing tactics, so I hope you don't mind. We can come back to the 6 points. But he's wondering, what was the reception of these myths in later medieval Ireland, particularly with respect to the Anglo-Norman colonization, if any? Do you have any thoughts on that, Richard?
I think it's a complicated question because certainly the Irish themselves, you know, pre-12th century, are able to accommodate both the pagan stories and the Christian narrative, and they make some interesting connections. And then when the Anglo-Normans come to town, you know, it doesn't affect the West and the North immediately. It's more in the Pale, as it's called, around Dublin. But eventually, this overclass is assimilated to various people in native Irish legend, for good and for bad, because they quickly game the system and learn the language. And talking now about the 12th to the 14th centuries, and eventually get integrated into the system. I speak in a way as a beneficiary of this because my grandmother was a Cusack from County Clare, but her ultimate ancestors were Normans, de Cusack. They got Gaelicized. And so there wasn't a whole lot of conflict, I think, unlike the 16th century events in the time of Elizabeth and then later Cromwell, which really produced a different kind of overclass. And there the Irish really clung to their native traditions. As you can see, you know, a long, complicated story, but if you visit the General Post Office in Dublin, there is a statue of the death of Cuchulain. And Cuchulain, thanks to people in 1916, became the ultimate symbol of resistance to the English.
Could we talk just briefly about the death of Cuchulain? Because there's actually, I think, a really interesting variant about that, but I think it's a little bit later, right? This idea that he dies attached to a pole, and there's another story I think that has to do with, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, geese or geese. It's sort of a taboo or a vow.
Yeah.
Can you talk a bit about that?
G-E-I-S,
yes.
Pronounced gesh.
Gesh, thank you. Can you talk a little bit about his death?
Yeah, it's not in the Táin Bócúine. There are separate stories, and you're right, there are multiple variants of the death of Cuchulain. And he is ultimately tied to the pillar because he can't stand up anymore. This is the way he sort of keeps himself alive. It's a kind of Rambo thing, like, you're never going to get me down. And involved in his death are also the war goddesses who've kind of teamed up against him. So the death is associated with this notion of taboo breaking. Every hero seems to have gesa, that's the plural of gesh, and you know, you violate these usually unconsciously. You don't realize you're doing it. It's kind of like Oedipus, doesn't know what he's doing, but doesn't matter. It's still going to get you if you violate the taboo. So I think his taboo had to do with. Now I'm going to merge it with another story, the destruction of Dodgerga's hostel, but even seeing certain people with certain color hair at the wrong time, you have to kind of prevent that. So Cuchulain dies, you know, what we would not think of as a really heroic death, I think, but it's more symbolic than anything, that totally immobilized, he's still standing. And it does look kind of like crucifixion, and people have wondered, are there Christian overtones? Is this kind of a competing story? Yeah, I don't know what else I can contribute at this point.
No, that's beautiful, yeah.
But, you know, what we might want to think of is heroic deaths in Greek, like Achilles, where the deck is stacked. So I think in the same way with Cuchulain, the deck is just stacked against him.
Mm-hmm. And those words that he has accepted right from the very start, right, which is that he will have fame, but it'll be a short life, right?
Yep.
That accepting it right from the beginning.
And now that you mention that, if we have a few more minutes, and people want to think about these motifs in relation to the Iliad, I think people's first response to this notion that we can see initiatory motifs in the Iliad is that, well, when we see Achilles, he's already a warrior. He's been there for 10 years. He's been a warrior from the get-go. We know that there are all kinds of stories about how he was raised by Charon, the centaur, and how he hunted you know, wild beasts when he was like 5 and 7 years old. You find these in the poetry of Pindar. And also there were paintings of him like even riding the back of the centaur in some cases. I would argue that you do see Achilles, however, through the brilliance of the Iliad as an initiatory warrior. And the way in which the poem does it, oddly enough, is through this withdrawal. We never see Achilles fight until Book 19. And we see Achilles acquire his armor, but it's the new godlike armor. And we see Achilles talking about his choice of long life versus fame, but we don't see him agreeing to one or the other. He kind of problematizes it in Book 9. So all I'm saying is that all of the things you would expect in a more normal composition to, have the author say, first this happened, then when he was 7, Achilles did this, then Achilles made the choice of long life, then Achilles got his weapons, then Achilles went to war. The Iliad embeds and kind of does through flashbacks and does through flash forwards. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where, for me, the Irish material becomes illuminating. Not to say the Irish is sort of amateurishly put together, it's also superbly crafted because you have it in this long flashback. It's Fergus MacRoig saying, and it's a kind of Halloween 13 horror movie setup, because before we even see Cuchulain on the field, we hear all about this berserk guy. So each composition does it in a different way, but I would insist that the Iliad really does want to make you think about the young, prepubescent Achilles and his choices and his initiation in real war, which is connected to his buddy, not his charioteer, but his buddy Patroclus.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to think about the way that these Irish myths are helping us to think about Achilles, about the choice that Achilles makes. I mean, when you see the quick response of Cuchulain to accepting that trade-off, it does make you think very carefully about the way that Achilles holds off at first. He says he's not going to make the trade-off.
Yep, yeah, and talk about suspense. Achilles could be Odysseus. Of course, Odysseus trumps the whole system because he gets fame and he gets a long life, apparently, with other adventures, even post-Ithaca. So that's yet another twist on the system. But by the time we get to these compositions, they are the farthest you can get from primitive narrative. They are so sophisticated in the way they blend in these themes.
I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts about anger, right? One of the themes that you brought up for us, number 4, was anger related to domestic violence, anger, sex, and violence, that trifecta. I wonder if anyone had a response to that or something else. Jack, you have something?
Well, I was thinking about the Odyssey and all the domestic violence in the Odyssey, and the Telemachy seen as a somewhat long digression. Basically the first 4 books of the Odyssey. But is this not sort of a setup for the father-son outburst of violence in the late books, and the sort of clean sweep that we see in the Táin?
So how about that, Richard? Violence within the family. What do you think?
I think that's perfect. I think that's right on. Why is the Telemachy even there? Scholars in the 19th century had problems with it. They wanted to cut it out. They thought it was extraneous. I think it's essential to the story. And talk about the initiation of the warrior. There he is, Telemachus. We're expecting him to be the next big hero. He doesn't quite make it. When we do pick up the story and the father is back, and Telemachus is finally going to get to show his stuff, even then he kind of messes up because he leaves the door open by mistake. Remember when they put the armor away in the other room? But Telemachus, it's not quite a gesh, but it's a failure, forgets to lock the door. So I think the Odyssey is very conscious of the hero at different stages, and it gives you this kind of holographic depiction of, turn it one way, you've got the young hero, Telemachus. Turn it another way, you've got the young hero, Odysseus, in his naming scene. Remember the flashback in Book 19 with the scar and the story of how he got his name, his initiatory wounding. And then turn it another way, and you see father and son and grandfather all together with Laertes as well. So it's really conscious of, I think, this progression of the hero. Now, violence there. We don't think of Odysseus as being as violent as Achilles, but I think he is in an even scarier way, and sometimes it seems to us unnecessarily. And the two examples I know you're thinking of are the suitors, why kill all 108, and the serving women, why string them up and have their feet kick for a while, but then not anymore. That's really, talk about women and violence in the house, a shocking scene.
Right. Any reaction to that, guys? Anyone have a further thought about women and violence? Yeah, Jackie.
Oh, no, I was just, when you were talking about Telemachus, it reminded me just that when he's ready to strut his stuff with his father and grandfather, that's when Athena closes it down and says, all right, we're not feuding anymore, so his chance for glory is gone. He's like, already, he's pumped. Yep, not happening. But which completes the whole cycle of the life stages of the hero. It is quite wonderful.
Well, yeah, I guess it's wonderful if you're not Telemachus, right? Because,
I meant that.
As you say, but it's wonderful for the city-state because it's the solution that the Eumenides of Aeschylus also has. Athena steps in, kind of makes everything right, says, hey, we're not going to have vendetta for the rest of eternity. This is the way things are going to be. And notice there, too, you could say it's the oppositional woman, goddess, who somehow deflects, I'm not going to say prevents, but deflects the heroism that perhaps Telemachus could have gotten. He could have been, the next fighter in the vendetta cycle, and she said, no more vendetta.
Right. I meant wonderful in how it was crafted.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, what I wonder about is the that as a setup to mercy, like at the end of the Táin in the version of Kinsella anyway. I know there are different ideas about how to put together all the different versions. He's merciful and doesn't kill Maeve, and Odysseus, of course, is merciful to the ones who are loyal. He trusts some people's opinion as to who is loyal. Like Phemius doesn't get whacked because he was just forced to do it. He was loyal to you. So I don't know if there's not a use of violence as a setup to peace or a setup to mercy, the Clementia Kaiseris, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. It certainly makes the hero look much better if you know what he could do, and then he doesn't do it, right? And he has a reason for not doing it. I'm thinking of the example, it's not in the Iliad, it's in the cyclic epics of, when Menelaus finally caught up with Helen, right? And he supposedly drew his sword, and we know this is an old story because it's on vase paintings of the 6th century BC and later. He drew his sword, he was going to kill his ex-wife or errant wife, and the story is that she bared her breasts, reminding him of happier days, and then he dropped his sword. So when we see them back in Odyssey Book 4, back home and being this kind domestic couple, we have to remember, well, at one point he almost chopped her head off after the war. And so Menelaus' mercy is not quite the rational mercy. It's like Cuchulain coming back from his episode and having the women of Ulster go out and bare their breasts. It's this kind of weird mix of maternal and erotic reaction. Whereas Odysseus, I think, is much more rational and calculating about sparing people. You mentioned Jack Phemius. It's a good idea to spare Phemius because how else is your Kleos going to get out there if you kill the poets? You want the media.
Exactly, yes. Oh, Hello, Richard?
Hello?
Oh, good. Okay, sorry, I thought we lost you for a second. Okay, yeah, exactly. I think you're saying that you don't want to kill the poet because you do want that word to get out there, right? You want people to keep talking and keep singing about you and
Right, and even maybe singing some of the scary stuff as well. But ultimately, remember, Phemius says to him, "Oh, Odysseus, I will sing to you as to a god," right? And I think that says it all. This is, he's trying to explain away that he was forced by the suitors to sing for them, but he will sing to Odysseus, "Host tolteo," like a god. That's like praise poetry. That's like Pindaric poetry, and that's what's going to get you into the tradition. And so, yes, Odysseus properly spares him, but it's also slightly out of self-interest.
Mm. Okay, unfortunately, I wish we could keep talking. We've only scratched the surface. It's 12:03.
No, we can do it again sometime.
Is that okay? I know
through the rest of medieval Irish literature, and
exactly.
I'm so impressed that this many more people now know about the Táin Bó Cúailnge and the rest of it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your enthusiasm for this literature. I know it's been a long, really lifelong love for you, so we're really appreciative that you shared it. I want to let everyone know that at hour 25, they can continue the conversation there in the discussion forum. So if we didn't get to your question, I'm so sorry, but please post it in the forums there, and we will get to it in the days to come. I want to thank all our participants for joining us today, the people who watched, and of course, Richard, I really want to thank you for your time and the care that you put into sharing these ideas with us.
It was a pleasure. Thank you all so much. It's always great to join this community.
Thank you so much. So until next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.